as we read through the chapter on African enslavement and the triangular trade, you will take the notes on your paper as I write them on the board. Let's begin. Turn to page 68 in your book and look at the section entitled Africans Are Transported to America. We will begin here and take notes according to the text. Africans are transported to America. During the 1600s, landowning colonists in the Chesapeake region needed workers to raise crops. Indentured servants filled this need, and most early indentured servants were English. Yet, as English immigration began to decline in the late 1600s, the demands for labor in the colonies grew. As a result, many colonists began to turn to another source of labor, enslaved Africans. As we read through the next section, Slavery in the Colonies Begins, you will pause to take some notes. Early in the 1600s, colonists often treated African workers just as they treated indentured servants, giving them their freedom after several years of service. Freed blacks could own land, vote, and even buy enslaved Africans of their own. By the mid-1600s, however, most colonies began to pass laws that supported the permanent enslavement of Africans. Let's note that the mid-1600s was when slavery in the colonies begins. In 1705, Virginia's General Assembly declared that all servants imported who are not Christians in their native country shall be accounted and be slaves. Other laws stated that the children of enslaved African Americans were also enslaved. This change in legal status promoted the racist idea that people of African origin were inferior to whites. Let's note that now Africans are seen less than whites. As we continue into the next section, the transatlantic slave trade, remember that the transatlantic slave trade was also called the triangular trade. Once established, slavery expanded rapidly. During the 1700s, the British colonies imported approximately 1.5 million enslaved Africans. The great majority went to the West Indies, but at least 250,000 came to the 13 colonies to labor on plantations and in homes. We will note that 1.5 million African slaves came in the 1700s. Traders purchased slaves from African merchants and chiefs in the coastal kingdoms of West Africa. Most of those enslaved were kidnapped by armed men or taken in wars between kingdoms. Although they did not directly seize slaves, Europeans promoted the trade by offering high prices for captives. It's important to remember that Africans sold Africans during enslavement. They did much of this for money. As we continue with the reading, we will review two terms that we had as definitions last week. Those two terms are triangular trade and middle passage. We'll first read the section, and second, we'll take down a definition for triangular trade, and then we'll read the section and take down the definition for middle passage. Enslaved Africans came to the Americas as part of a three-part voyage called the Triangular Trade. Slave traders sailed from Europe to Africa, where they traded manufactured goods for enslaved Africans. So, Europe to Africa to Americas. Remember, in the Americas, they also went to the West Indies, which we now call the Caribbean. Then, in the Middle Passage, shippers carried the enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the American colonies. After selling the slaves for colonial produce, the traders returned to the mother country. So the Middle Passage is a part of the Triangular Trade. Specifically, slave passage to America. Sadly, it was brutal what they did. Let's find out what happened on the Middle Passage. The brutality of the Middle Passage was extreme. On a voyage that lasted 2 months or more, enslaved Africans suffered the psychological trauma of separation from their families and villages as they sailed toward a strange land and an unknown future. So, when they were put onto the ships, they were on there at least 2 months, but sometimes more. Slave traders branded their cargo, which were the Africans, with hot irons, placed them in shackles, and jammed them into dark holes so crowded that the slaves could barely move. The foul air promoted disease, and the ill might be thrown overboard to prevent the spread of disease. Some Africans, hoping for death, refused to eat. So as our second note, we will note that Africans were treated like cattle. So, on the Middle Passage, they went from human to inhuman. Slave traders had an interest in delivering a large and healthy cargo. However, due to the conditions, at least 10% of those making the Middle Passage in the 1700s did not survive. So multiple Africans would die just on the Middle Passage route. Let's continue with how Africans in the Americas survived. Following the ordeal of the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans faced a bleak future in America. At slave auctions, colonial buyers often broke up families to make it more difficult to plot escape or rebellion. The newly enslaved were ordered about in an unfamiliar language and put to work beside strangers who shared only their skin color. Arriving with distinct languages and identities, the Ashantis, Fulanis, Igbos, and many others, the enslaved forged a new culture as African Americans. Slavery in the North and the South. Slavery varied considerably by region. In 1750, enslaved African Americans were small minorities in New England and the Middle Colonies. In those two regions, most enslaved African Americans labored as farmhands, dock workers, sailors, and house servants. So let's note that they were laborers in the North. And North means both the New England and Middle Colonies. Many more enslaved African Americans lived in the southern colonies where they raised labor-intensive crops of tobacco, rice, indigo, or sugar. In the Chesapeake, they comprised 40% of the population. In coastal South Carolina, enslaved African Americans outnumbered the white population. To maximize their profits, masters demanded as much work as possible while minimizing the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing slaves. Most of the enslaved lived in crude huts with dirt floors, no windows, and few furnishings. Their work was long and hard, at least 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, under the close supervision of a white overseer who whipped those who resisted. So in the South, slaves were farmhands who worked 6 days a week and suffered under an overseer. And an overseer is a white person on the farm who made sure that the slaves didn't rebel, As we continue on, we'll start to notice that the enslaved African Americans now had to create their own culture. In the earlier part of the reading, it said that there was multiple identities, Ashantis, Fulanis, Igbos, and many others, that were coming with various language and different styles of living. In the American colonies, they were all forced to develop and adapt to one new culture. What they created was now called the African American culture, which later develops into African American culture as we know it today. So continuing on page 70, with developing a new culture. In the colonies, African Americans developed a rich culture based on African traditions and their circumstances in America. Most African Americans adopted the Christianity of their masters, blending it with some African religious traditions. They modified African instruments, crafting banjos, rattles, and drums to create a music that emphasized rhythm and percussion. So if you think about it, banjos, which are often seen as an idea of the South or an image of the South, were actually created by the enslaved Africans. So, in developing a new culture, we're going to say that the Africans combined American and Native traditions. Remember that their native traditions weren't all the same, so they were combining traditions of different localities and different tribes. As we continue our reading, letter C begins our rebels and runaways. The rebels and runaways are important to note because we want to see that Africans who were enslaved still tried to fight back against their masters. Slaveholders could never break enslaved African Americans' longing to be free. So slaveholders could never break enslaved African Americans' longing to be free. In the South, and especially in the West Indies, some enslaved African Americans rebelled. On the mainland, the largest uprising erupted in 1739 at Stono in South Carolina, where about 100 slaves killed 20 whites before suffering defeat and execution. So we'll add that in the 1700s, specifically 1739, Stono uprising. So we do see that African Americans were actually trying to fight back against their enslavement and fight back against their owners. If they weren't fighting back, they also had other ways of trying to get away, which was running away. Running away was more common. In the West Indies and the Carolinas, enslaved African Americans became Maroons, a name for those who hid in forests or swamps. Other runaways fled to more remote Native American villages or to Florida, where the Spanish welcomed them with food, land, and freedom. The Spanish sought to weaken the British colonies and to strengthen their own frontier militia with freed African Americans. In the Chesapeake and northern colonies, runaways tried to fit into the small, free black communities. So, the runaways were trying to get into places that weren't predominantly enslavement areas. One such place was Florida, and they also went to Native American villages. And remember, in Florida, they were only being treated with freedom because the Spanish wanted to gain power. Spanish wanted power. So, let's find out what happens with those African Americans who do become free. Free African Americans. Although most African Americans remained slaves for life, a few did obtain their freedom. For example, an enslaved African American might manage to earn money and purchase his or her freedom, or might be set free by a slave owner. So they could purchase freedom or be set free. Sometimes slave owners would say in their will that certain slaves would be set free after their death. Phillis Wheatley. Free African Americans tended to live in cities where they faced discrimination. A rare few managed to overcome enormous obstacles to distinguish themselves. One example was Phillis Wheatley of Boston. Let's look at the History Maker section to continue on Phillis Wheatley. Phillis Wheatley was the first African American to publish a book of poems. Captured at about age 7 in West Africa, she was sold to John Wheatley, a Boston tailor. The Wheatleys allowed Phillis to learn to read, write, and study. She had her first poem published in 1767 in a Rhode Island newspaper. She won praise in the colonies and in Britain for her 1770 poem about the preacher George Whitefield. However, colonial publishers refused to publish a book of her poetry. Phillis and the Wheatleys found a London publisher to print her volume of poetry, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, in 1773. That year, the Wheatleys granted Phillis her freedom. She married in 1778, but lived in poverty until her death. So, she was from Boston. She was African American. And she was a poet. And we'll add that she was a female poet. It is important to note because most of the enslaved Africans that do gain their freedom that we often talk about are male African Americans. So Phillis Wheatley was one of the first female African Americans who not only gained her freedom, but gained something else. So as we come to the end of this section, we notice that there's two major things that we want to remember. One is that the triangular trade really destroyed the African continent by bringing Africans out of their own freedom through the Middle Passage over to enslavement in America. When they came over to America and were enslaved, they had to create their own new culture. Without this enslavement, we wouldn't have had cash crops in the South that ended up getting sent back to Europe in the form of tobacco, either for pipe or for chew, or rum, which was often seen as something coming specifically from the West Indies and using sugarcane, which was also a cash crop. So remember triangular trade, enslavement, and the destruction of the African continent.